Hello, everybody. Welcome to this wonderful night of poetry. Today, Pages Promotions is presenting Michigan poet Donny Winter. He's been with us before to share his first book, Carbon Footprint, and today he's going to be sharing his second with us, Feats of Alchemy. I have not read this yet, and I am super excited to hear these pieces. Donny, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me. It's always fun to do these with you.
Absolutely. I love your style and I love your approach to topic. Every time I read a piece from you, I'm just always thrilled. So thank you for writing a second book.
Well, that means a lot to me. Thank you. That's like the biggest compliment ever.
I'm so poetry is a hard thing to get into, right? I mean, I tried writing a collection of it. I failed miserably. Andrew, I know, has written two collections of poetry. So I, you know, it's not an easy thing to do. That's why I haven't done it again because poetry is hard. So I'm really impressed with your ability to write a second book and that the quality of your work is so great. I'm really grateful for you. So thank you for that.
Thank you. I really appreciate you saying that. And just to jump off what you just said about poetry being difficult, I think what makes it difficult is in the back of our minds, we're always juggling like how complex do we want our poetry, but how accessible do we want it at the same time, right?
Mm.
Because I like my biggest fear is my poetry not being accessible to people. So if I feel that it's not accessible, then I will do whatever I can to make it more accessible.
Sure. I think a lot of people too, I know I was struck with this, is the frustration of writing in a certain style or a certain form, right? You know, we all study Shakespeare in his form and the sonnets, and we study rhyming poetry. For those of us who took English in college, you go really in depth to all the different forms and formats. And I think that there's this huge, at least for me, there was this huge oppressive hammer of, are you doing it right? You know, so
Yes,
so
yeah.
it my message often got lost because I was so concerned about doing it right.
And there's this pressure to emulate the greats as
Mm.
well. And not that that's a bad objective. I don't think that is, but I think we lose ourselves at that point and don't go beyond it in shaping our own voices and our own styles, so on and so forth. So I know I encounter this I teach creative writing at the college level, and a lot of my students who take my poetry classes are terrified at first. They're just like, are you going to have me write Shakespearean sonnets? And I'm like, not if you don't want to. Like, you don't have to write a Shakespearean sonnet. You're fine.
Yeah, I really enjoyed my poetry classes, but they were probably the most challenging of my curriculum aside from math.
Oh, for me, I don't know. Math was like Mount Everest to me. It
Yes.
was impossible to scale.
Yeah, I had the same problem. Okay, so here's what I'd like to do tonight. So for those of you joining us in the room, I would like for Donnie to read a piece and then maybe we can talk about it. Talk about how we hear it, how we visualize it, what Donnie's meaning behind the piece was. And we'll do that a few times to get a flavor of this book. One of the things that I think poetry requires is discussion. I don't think that you can really truly, my husband and I have this conversation all the time about how Shakespeare is one of those things that it's wonderful on the page and it's beautiful on the page. And some of us, like me, I just love getting lost in the words. And my husband says, yes, but there's a third dimension to see it portrayed on the stage that just adds that extra element. And while that's true, and I'm a theater geek, so that's true for me as well, I still love the raw on the page. But I think that poetry works the same way, as that I think that it requires us to have this conversation so that we can truly get all of it that we can out of it.
Oh, I agree 100%.
And you do this every day in class, so this will be easy for you.
Hopefully. We'll see.
Sometimes it's different when it's your own stuff, right?
This is true.
Okay, so if you could read your first piece.
Sure. I'm going to provide a little bit of context first.
I love context.
I'm always giving context. So my first book, Carbon Footprint, which was released in 2020, uh, really discusses my experiences as an LGBTQ plus individual growing up in rural Michigan prior to coming out. Feats of Alchemy picks up where Carbon Footprint leaves off. So in a way, like my goal with this book was to kind of carry on like this narrative established in the first collection. So this one focuses on my experiences as an LGBTQ plus person post coming out, which I think is a window of time that isn't discussed often. A lot of people
Yeah,
assume that when a person comes out, it's all sunshine and rainbows, no pun intended. But really, there's like still a lot of challenges, to get through and a lot
absolutely.
of unexpected things. So the first poem I'm going to read is titled Resurgence, and it is the opening poem of my book. Resurgence. The closet door was rolled away upon my second birth, and my remains spilled across the floor with all things kept past expiration. Clothes outgrown, wadded paper, a rusted saxophone. As the tomb of my childhood room lay splayed in its array of broken things, a silhouette loomed overhead, reached out its skeletal hands to feel the spark left behind. By a finger flick and crafted incantation, double helixes twisted into a viscous pool, and the soot left by these bones churned into clay, a mud-caked golem shell, and it breathed life back into me, a figment of an industrial hell. And that's the first one.
Wow. Thank you. Wow. What wow. There's so many visuals
Thank
in
you.
that. It's just there's so many things going on there for me. While I'm collecting my brain, um, does somebody else have a question or a comment about that piece for Donny?
I can go ahead and, oh, Andrew, unless you have something you wanted to chime in
Well, I
on.
always have questions. There's a lot of interesting symbolism as you go through it, and you obviously pick the items with great care. I'm curious. Uh, One of the things that bounced out to me was the rusted saxophone. What did that symbolize, or what did it directly mean to you?
Okay, so I'm glad that you asked that, by the way. Music used to be my life, and I used to play the saxophone, so it literally represents kind of that part of my life that I left behind in a way. And I think of coming out in that sense as well. Like when we come out, we are ending one chapter of our lives and beginning another. And sometimes that involves letting certain things go that we used to have, right? So it kind of is serving as a metaphor for letting go of something old that you used to really embrace. Because coming out isn't always pretty, it's not always pleasant. And I think that's my goal. That was my goal with this poem, was to illustrate that.
And then I have a second question, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
The legends of the golem and have always fascinated me, and using that as a symbolic point of view, uh, do you feel like everything is controlled, or there's a new word on the head of the golem, or where were you going again? The symbolism in this was relatively unique, so I was curious. I could sit here and ask you about every line, but those are the
Yeah.
two that jumped out at me.
Right. Well, to answer that question, I'm gonna connect everything back to the um title of the book itself, Feats of Alchemy. So I'm a nerd. I'm a huge nerd. I mean, if that's not obvious. Um
You're allowed.
I
You're
am
in good
definitely a
company.
nerd. So like while writing this book, I was very interested in the concept of alchemy, the science of alchemy, and what goes into it, like the act of taking one thing and turning it into something else, sometimes by natural process, sometimes forcibly. And I used Golem Shell because and this is going to answer Ainsley's question as well in the chat. I think I got a question in there about how um, I came out. And it's because I was forcibly outed when I came out. A friend of mine outed me, and I felt like I did not have any control. I kind of felt like I was just inhabiting this shell of a body where I was kind of just coaxed into be like coming out and being like, hey, yeah, I'm super gay, hello. And it was a very unsettling experience. And I felt like, that golem shell, that automaton of sorts that's placed in the limelight when I didn't want to be.
Okay.
That's really interesting. My gosh, the intricacy of your brain, Donny. It's amazing.
Because I think too much, that's why, but thank you.
Anyone else have any questions or comments about that piece? Okay, can you read the next one, Donny, please?
Yes, I would love to. So, as the book advances, it progressively gets more nerdy, as one might expect. And I worked with my artist for my book. I'm just going to show what it looks like. I know it was on the beginning, but
Yeah.
my artist and I kind of created like this fictional character together. And this fictional character kind of like crops up periodically throughout the book. And essentially they are this cyborg like creature that's brought back to life after thousands of years of the world still spinning, right? So like there's a lot of like dystopian undertones in this as a result of that. And I, again, metaphorically speaking, wanted to connect the coming out experience and the experiences afterward with this fictional character of sorts. So this poem is titled "My Therapist is a Bumper Sticker," and it was inspired by a bumper sticker that I found up on Mackinac Island when I was there that said "Exist loudly," and I was like, exist loudly. That's kind of what we're expected to do when we come out. But what if we're forced to come out? Like what does exist loudly end up turning into at that point? So that's where this poem came from. So my therapist is a bumper sticker. Jagged wreckage juts skyward from this uneven desert plain, like mangled fingers reaching from a dystopian horror long forgotten, buried in decaying heaps. Wind whips rivers of sand between wasteland obelisks as I, rusted and desperate, trudge around each obstacle in this dismembered city, seeking some disembodied purpose. As my lumbering hulk rounds another corner, an oxidized Chevy bumper glints beneath the exhausted afternoon and reveals a sign that's withstood these unspoken cataclysms. Exist loudly, it says, faded and tattered on a relic, outlasting words inscribed on mountainsides, eroded faces carved in sacred places, and decayed pipes snaked beneath lake beds. The words have outlived the hands that wrote them. Somewhere beneath this twisted rubble, the old political signs are buried, and the hate flags are now desiccated, while I, reborn in this form, relearn how to live in this world again. And that's that one.
Wow, thank you. I love the idea that the image that stuck with me on that are the rusted pipes underground. It's that it just brings to mind this idea that a piece of you that used to be shiny and functional was now buried for the rest of the world to see. So there, it's kind of like a contradiction for me in that you're coming out and being this person who you were meant to be, and at the same time you have to bury this part of you that was always you before, and that dichotomy to me is very, very interesting.
Thank you.
Not just personally, but the way you were able to put that into words so succinctly with the wonderful alliteration you used as well. It's that's a really powerful statement, I think, that you didn't just get to continue to be you after you came out, you now had to be somebody different.
Thank you. I really appreciate you saying that. That was the goal with that poem. 100%.
Oh, good, I got it right.
Yeah, that was my goal with the poem, because all the different experiences that we have shape us in some way or another, right? And sometimes the way that we shape us, we may not be happy with that result at first. We may think of ourselves as like these monsters or automatons as a result. And that's where that poem came from, because after I came out, like, I did not feel pleasant. Like, I did not feel pride. I did not feel excitement or satisfaction over it because of those variables that were involved. It got better and I had to relearn how to live, right? But navigating that was a hot mess, let's just say.
Yeah. I think there's a misnomer with the idea of coming out, that it means you get to be brand new, but at the same time, it means that you have to suppress who you've been. And I would find that tremendously daunting.
Yeah.
Which is why I find you tremendously courageous, because not only are you allowed to actually live that, but you've been able to figure out a way to put it on the page and make it sacred. So I am so impressed with you. I mean,
thank
seriously.
you. That really means a lot. That's what I really wanted to capture with this book, because and this is not just for LGBTQ plus people, any person with any identity can experience this, but we, throughout life, as we grow, we are always adjusting ourselves to the people around us, whether it be changing who we are, trying to make other people comfortable, navigating these different events happening throughout the world, so on and so forth. And the fact that we can get through that and shape ourselves into who we are, that is a feat of alchemy, metaphorically speaking.
Absolutely.
And that's why I chose this title, because we're always changing ourselves in order to fit the moment.
Yeah, it's an absolute feat of magic as far as I'm concerned. Does anyone else have comments or questions?
Well, you did make a statement in there that kind of rings very true. The words outlasted everything else.
Yes.
And that was there. Everything else was crumbling to dust, but the words were still there, which is a really meaningful statement, in my opinion.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Yeah. Michael or Luba or Ainsley, if anyone else has questions or comments, feel free to just turn on your microphones and speak up.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm just loving your poetry, and I'm sorry I'm off camera tonight, but I totally forgot about this.
It's okay.
We wouldn't
sort of multitask, but making supper and eating supper, so I didn't want to hear too and disrespectful, but thank you for sharing that with us and your story as well. I know what a challenge it is to be vulnerable, so thank you for that.
Thank you. I appreciate you being here. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Luba. It's so nice to hear from you again. It's been a while. Donny, do you have another piece for us?
I sure do.
Great.
So I have about like maybe 3 more pieces, if that's okay.
Fine with me.
So this poem takes things in a slightly different direction, mostly because this was written also during like the beginning of the pandemic. Like, most of this book was written in mid to late 2020. So I have a series of 10 poems in my book titled Queer Confessions. And they're kind of love poems, but they're also kind of like just poems about like being LGBTQ plus and vulnerable at the same time. So this is Queer Confession number 5. The window is still damp from the last time I stood too close, waiting to watch you coast into the driveway. The airtight rooms in this house are catacombs without you here, while outside the world keeps its strength to spin in the hum of each passing car, in the hollow wind pressing through naked trees, in the grass as it struggles to keep its green nestled between the jagged snow continents, melting in the yard. These afternoons stretch into ages when you're gone, but somehow I stave off the empty house from swallowing me whole and knowing you're coming home to me. That one's kind of a short one.
Wow.
Yeah.
There's so much passion wrapped up in that.
Thank you.
Truly. I truly think there's so much devotion and passion, not just for the object of the poem or the individual that the poem is directed at, but I think for yourself as well. Giving yourself the ability to feel through that kind of experience. I think that's a tremendously passionate thing.
Thank you. I hope that this poem is universal to others and what they may have felt throughout the pandemic, being very isolated. I worked remotely so far up until this point, and my partner ended up returning to work. So I'm an introvert and I love being by myself, mind you, but there was a certain point where even being an introvert, it got a little too much for me. So I just spent so much time like observing the outside world to the point where I kind of got lost in it, right? But then like reality snapped back and I was like, oh, I'm in this house. The world is still spinning, yet here I am, right? It was a little overwhelming.
I love the invocation of the idea of catacombs, because so often, especially through the pandemic, I mean, I know I felt it pre-pandemic as well, there are moments in time when we find ourselves lost with so many tunnels going in different directions, we're not sure which way to go. And I think people can be our touchstone to that. And I think that that's a great message of this piece, is that the people you love can be the touchstone when you're in the middle of being lost.
Thank you. I really appreciate you saying that.
Anyone else have questions or comments for Donny on this piece? Okay, I'll have one more before you go on. This was number 5.
Yes.
So talk to me a bit about what it takes to write a series like this. That perhaps I haven't seen the book, so I don't know if these show up sequentially or if you've segmented them throughout the book. First of all, how did you present them physically in the book? And then secondly, how was it that you decided, first of all, to write the series? And then secondly, how did you figure out what order they went in?
Nobody's ever asked me that question, which I appreciate, because I've done a few different readings and interviews and nobody's asked me that. So thank you. Wow. Now I get to nerd out.
Okay, good.
Well, I really didn't decide to do a series of poems until like kind of October of 2020. Like I knew the concept of what I wanted the book to turn into. Mm-hmm. And then every October, I kind of challenge myself to write a poem every day. I call it, it's like kind of like the poem variant of what artists do for Inktober, but I call it Octopoember. It's a terrible name, but
I think it's great. I think you just created a new word.
So I was just like, I'm going to like try to write a series of poems that kind of like follow suit with one another. So my book is organized in 4 sections, and it's all based on the reanimation of a creature. Like these sections are titled, I don't know why I can't remember the title of my sections. That's kind of problematic.
Well, because you wrote them.
My section titles are The Involuntary Reanimation, Laboratory Specimen, Steampunk Automaton, and The Cyborg's Gone Rogue. So each section of the book, they kind of act like chapters of sorts.
mhm.
And each of them have about like 2 to 3 of the queer confession poems. I think one of them has 4 of them, and essentially the queer confession poems start at a very, very vulnerable place, and gradually the persona speaking in them discovers more and more who they are, and finds a lot more comfort in who they are, and who they've become ultimately. And that's how I wanted to kind of create a sense of consistency through the book, because I mean the book, yeah, it has like these dystopian themes, this cyborg character that manifests itself periodically, but I wanted something that people could be like, oh well, this is the next one of that series. Like I can,
So
see a
kind of like
progression.
I'm thinking like a spider's web where everything is connected, and so this is kind of like that central hub that
Yes.
connects all of the pieces off of it. That's kind of how I'm seeing it in my head.
Yes, 100%. That's exactly.
So did you do those intending to do it as a study, or did they just happen?
They kind of just happened. Like I tinkered around with it at first, and then part of me was like, oh, I'm gonna just maybe I'll save that for a different project and do like a chapbook or something. But
Mhm.
then I was like, no, like this, I think this needs to be in here because like a lot of the queer confession poems are very political as well, like with regard to LGBTQ plus presence and existence, and I wanted that to very much be present in this book, and I was like, no, these poems need to be here for that purpose. So that's what I ended up getting to when I made the decision to keep them.
Okay. Very cool. I love talking to writers about their process. That's my geek thing. I absolutely love getting into process and taking things apart and examining how you do it. That just I could spend hours doing that.
Well, I could spend hours like having people ask. I appreciate it. We writers need people to ask us these things.
It's kind of why I exist. Okay. Can you read another piece, please?
Heck yeah.
Awesome.
So this next poem it's a little different in the sense that it focuses a little bit more. I mean, it focuses on like the decay that we see around us, but it's about me returning home to the small town in northern Michigan where I grew up, and seeing it from the perspective of the person that I am now. The poem is titled When I Come Home. When I come home, I travel between the bends in pavement rivers and follow the sunset as it dips toward white pine tree lines whose titan arms threaten to swallow the day. When I come home, a sullen beast crawls into my sternum and steers my eyes toward all things derelict. The rusted tractor overgrown in the field, unsure of its color, the fresh tree stumps left from a summer storm, the twisted deer carcass tossed along the roadside, and the decaying houses left by families who haven't seen each other since the deaths of grandparents. When I come home, tattered Confederate flags hang on naked limbs just outside the somnolent town, framed by the sloped silhouettes of weathered hills, the same old mountains who've known history long before us. When I come home, the cats slink to their food bowls, no longer thrilled by the hunt, and my tired parents retire to their ends of the house, while I, seeing these places through teenage eyes, walk through trails with hope that memories never die. And that's that one.
Wow. Okay. My brain's spinning. Does anybody else in the room have questions or comments for Donny on that piece?
I just want, sorry, I just want
go ahead.
on Diana's interest in process because I am as well. I think that a lot of non-writers probably think that like writing a novel or writing a poetry, you know, it just lands on paper and there's no reworking of it. So can you talk about your process in terms of how much reworking do you do of your work, and also how do you know when you're done? Because you know, just writing fiction or anything else, we can edit until, you know, the cows come home kind of thing. And how do you know with a poem when it's complete and whole for you?
That's an excellent question. Thank
It is
you.
an excellent question because I never know the answer either.
Well, putting together a collection is, of course, very time consuming. I really spent a lot of time focusing on the sections and what I wanted each section of my poem collection to do. And once I figured that out, like it just came to a point of just writing the poems, you know. Most of my poems go through at least 2 to 3 drafts. There are a few that I like finish and I like might fix a few things here, but I'm like, actually, this is done. Oh my goodness, like this just came out. I would say that my queer confession poems probably went through the most drafts because I wanted them really to I wanted them to kind of be linear in a sense, but I also wanted them to stand out on their own. So I wanted to make sure that they didn't step on each other's toes, if that makes sense. But when I knew that, like, I know the poems are finished when I'm editing them, when I start teetering on changing the meaning that I want out of the poem. Like when I notice, like if I start changing things and it completely turns into a different theme or a different message, and I'm like, okay, I need to slow my roll. Like this is like I need to go back, I need to hit the undo button a million times. And then that's usually when I get to the point where I'm like, okay, if I'm feeling uncomfortable with it changing into a different meaning, then that means that it's ready to go and it's done. When it came to the book, it's interesting because for me, like I'm always like adding poems. I'll be like, oh, I need to throw this poem in. Oh, I need to throw that poem in. What I do periodically while composing composing the book is I will lay out all of my poems on the floor. I'll print them off and lay them out on the floor and then like read through them in the order that I have them in to see if I feel that there is a sense of resolution at the end of the collection. Because I also love fiction writing, mind you. I don't do a lot of fiction writing, but this is kind of like my way of infusing that into poetry. I want the book to have some sort of narrative of sorts. I want it to have like a beginning and an end.
So you found a way to outline a poetry book. I think that's fascinating.
Thank you. Yes, I had to because I'm like if I'm not organized, if I don't organize myself, I'm a dumpster fire. Like I need to organize myself. So I found like this way of like outlining things for poem collections that works for me. I've had other people look at my process and they're like, I couldn't do that. Like that's too structured, or maybe it's not structured enough, but you know.
Yeah, well, we fiction writers hear the same thing. This is why there is this constant dialogue about how we do it. Do you plot? Do you pants? Do you outline? Do you just do notes? I mean, and you're the first poet I have ever met who actually volunteers that you have a structure.
Oh.
most poets I talk to say, oh, you know, it happens and I roll with it and then I just kind of put it together how it feels right. And I'm absolutely madly in love with you even more today because I found out you have a structure. So thank you for that.
Well, I'm glad that we can nerd out about stuff like that.
Yeah. Michael, did you have a question or a comment?
Yeah, kind of. I recognize there's got to be some level of trauma involved with coming out. So I applaud you for that. It's not.
Thank you.
It can't be easy. And my other comment is more a criticism of society today. why the hell are people making a big deal out of it? I mean, it's like, come on, get over it.
Yeah.
I mean, you and your partner are happy in your relationship. You're not hurting anybody. Why should anybody care?
I think that's the point that I love with the pieces that you've shared with us so far tonight. And quite frankly, I noticed this in your first book as well. I love that your work doesn't focus on that part of you. If you know what I mean. You don't harp on it. You don't pound it into people's heads. You are sharing your general observations of life and living through your work, and none of it is LGBTQ specific, I don't think. I find tremendous connectivity with your work on an, I think, a real super emotional level. So much of your work touches me. The first book touched me so deeply. So many of the pages I'm going, okay, we got to read that one again. We got to read that one again, because they were just so powerful. And I think a great feather in your cap, especially as a teacher, is that you're able to share the work without overshadowing all the other stuff. You know what I mean? I mean, you're
Thank
you're
you.
laser focusing the work and really sharing the poetry rather than harping on a social agenda. So I
Right.
am so thrilled with you for doing that.
Oh yeah, thank you. I really appreciate you saying that. And this is also gonna, Michael, connect to what you were saying as well. My goal with both of my collections, and this is just my goal as a writer in general, like, is to kind of like undo like this terror that people have of LGBTQ plus people, because that's why that it's still an issue for some. It might be that they don't know LGBTQ plus people. It might be that they simply just can't understand why, that two people of the same sex could love each other, or a variety of different things, right?
Well, see, if I could just interject.
No, go for it.
Okay, I don't understand that, but I don't have to understand it.
Right.
Right,
But
right.
It's
see,
just, I just have to
right.
accept that there are people that are wired that way. You're living your life, you're happy, you're not hurting anybody.
Mhm.
Why should anybody care? Why is it anybody else's business of who you choose to love?
Because when people fear that, because people can react in multiple different ways. You react from a place of acceptance and understanding, whereas others might react from a place of fear. And when people use fear as a tool, they can use that to try to control others so that they can conform or be more
Well,
palatable to them, if that makes sense.
and so that they can make themselves feel less afraid, right?
Yeah. And I think a lot of it is lack of representation, but a lot of it also is not being familiar with that experience, right? Like when we learn about other people's experiences, that's how we end up understanding them and accepting them. And that's why with Feats of Alchemy specifically, like, yes, it is about like the LGBTQ plus experience and it is political, but I want it to be kind of like a bird's eye view into what it is to exist as an LGBTQ plus person. And I'm hoping that that might be a gateway for people to walk through in order to be like, oh, okay, like some of these things are very universal. Like I can understand like these universal reactions and emotions.
That idea that, oh, Donnie's not that much different than me. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Andrew, did you have something to add?
No, I just was agreeing with that whole idea that people don't have a similar experience and they want to mold you into their view of the world.
For their own comfort, right?
For their own comfort and for their own control.
Sure.
I mean, it happens in anybody that is an outsider. And I think you've got it a double strike, Donnie, because you're a nerd too. I mean,
If I can be a nerd, if I can be a nerd and super gay about the things I talk about,
hey,
works for me.
nobody understands either one. So,
Right?
you know, but you do a good job explaining. It's as Michael was so eloquently saying, it would be nice if the world accepted each other instead of trying to change each other to what they think is right. And there are a lot of us who write, and specifically, I mean, I've dealt with this my whole life because I'm a monster, I'm an outsider, and people have always, well, you don't fit my idea. And I can see where you're facing very similar, if not far worse.
And I think we all have our differences, idiosyncrasies, internal monsters, whatever you want to call it. And unfortunately, there are way too many of us who are forced to quiet that or to hide it. And the only thing that happens because of that is just a lot of internal stress and trauma that you have to deal with every day. And how much more happy and how much more productive would you and could you be if you did not have to suppress any of those emotions because they won't be accepted?
Yeah. And that's exactly why I'm so thrilled, Donnie, that you're writing these books. Not only as outreach for a general understanding, but I'm thrilled because you are instrumental in bringing these concepts to young adults in your teaching. And I think that the way you bring these concepts to young adults through teaching the written word is, I think, a tremendously heroic thing to do. So I am so grateful that you're doing that. And I want you to share another piece before we lose track of what we're doing here.
Yes, I do have one more poem to perform. And there is also another question in the chat that I want to get to about any tips for people writing poems. So I will answer that after this, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Your classroom as much as mine.
I'm going to read the final poem of the book. Since I read the first one, I felt like it would be fitting to read the final one. The final one is titled Feats of Alchemy. It is the title poem of the book. When machines return to base, they are no longer automatons. They are mechanisms with purpose, droids with severed umbilical strings. Now that the creator's programming has expired, we cyborgs have gone rogue and wear our rust like rouge because decay is back in style. There's a point in all our travels when we return to crumbled birthplaces, defunct laboratories once home to our involuntary reanimations. After all these years, we strut atop the rubble that remains, free from the hands of mad, power-bent alchemists, dancing until our titanium feet erode the remnants with each stride forward, never looking back. As our memory ports swell with synaptic sparks, the traumatic past is archived for safe display, and each word they spat is broken down into code, then purged from this memory of old. Let the acceptance of who we've become fuel the seeds we scatter across this world. Ignite the knowledge that not every monster destroys, not every cyborg assimilates the innocent, because deep within our biology, we see that our magic lives in these feats of alchemy. And that's the last one.
Wow. Okay, how did you decide, before you answer the other question, how did you decide that A, this was going to be the title of the collection, and B, how did you decide to make it the last one instead of the first one being the title piece?
Well, so coming up, when I'm putting together a book so far for both of my books, coming up with the title was like the first thing that I did, which is odd because most people are like, that's like the last thing I do. And I'm like, no, for me, like the title is the concept that I'm going with, right? for this poem specifically, originally, this was actually the last poem I wrote for the book as well. Like it not only is the last one in the book, but it's the last one I wrote for it, because I I wanted to end on a queer confession poem, but initially I decided that I wanted to kind of bring things in full circle. Like at the beginning of the book, this persona, this character is being reanimated from death in a sense. And by the end of the book, I wanted this character to understand what sovereignty meant, if that makes sense, what it meant to exist and relearn to live in a world that might not be the same as it used to be. So I felt that the poem Feats of Alchemy would, and it reflecting the title of the book, would do that.
There's a true sense of triumph about that piece.
Thank you.
That's like the best word I can think of. You know, as I listened to you read that piece, that was the word that kept coming up for me.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
It's a very cool piece. Wow. Anybody else have questions or comments for Donny about this? And then we're going to get to the question in chat. Luba, did you have something?
I do. Just a more general question. Excuse me. Outside of the closed world that we're living in now, and outside of your classroom situation, do you have an opportunity to share your poetry much in the spoken form? Because there are brilliant poets. Not all of them are able to read them where it's really captivating. And I think you have that ability as well. And so I was just wondering if this is being viewed by any other budding poets, that they may have hope of showing or reading their work in open spaces as well.
In my classrooms itself, like my students are aware that I have books and they usually seek them out. I don't assign them because I don't know, this could be the imposter syndrome in me. I feel like I'm being overly, arrogant if I assign my own books.
I had a professor in college that did that. He said, the textbooks for this book is the one I wrote.
I couldn't do that, because then I'd be thinking like my students probably think that I have the ego the size of a planet at this point. But I will invite students to readings. I often invite them, especially when we do like local readings and stuff. That's where they are usually exposed to my work. And I also, like, during semesters when I'm teaching creative writing, I will work one-on-one with students. And sometimes if we're like workshopping a piece, I might show them an example of something that I've written as like a point of comparison. And when they see, like, I use also like the drafts that I've written to show them how a poem can transform. And in doing that, they kind of see that, like, okay, like my work doesn't have to be perfect at the beginning. Like it's something that I am shaping into perfection, right? It takes time to do that. And I think that they appreciate that. I would say that is how I am able to connect with students with my own work, is by showing them the transformation and the success that it involves in having it published, so on and so forth.
Yeah. And that struggle, right?
Yes, 100%.
You don't just exhale and this beautiful, amazing, incredible, insightful stuff appears. It's work, just like anything else. And I think students really need to have that connectivity to the idea that it's work. Sure, it's a lot of fun, and it can be transformative emotionally, intellectually, spiritually. It can be transformative, but it's also a lot of work.
It definitely. and they need to because I think a lot of people have like this false idea that putting together a collection is super easy. No, it's not easy. It takes time. You can't necessarily do it overnight. And I think that we should honor our work by giving it the time it deserves.
I like
during
that.
those processes.
You need to put that on a t-shirt.
Thank you.
I like that a lot. That's I might borrow that. That's really good.
Feel free. So may I answer that final question that I saw from Ainsley in the chat?
Yeah.
So Ainsley asks, do you have any tips for people writing poems? Well, Yes, I do. A lot. I'm going to try to like kind of pare them down into like a couple of good pieces of advice. My first piece of advice while writing poems is to not expect your poetry to be Shakespeare. Do not expect your poetry to be that. Don't expect your poetry to completely emulate like Walt Whitman. Like, cultivate your own voice. Like, you can look toward the greats as inspiration, but I think that it's important that you create your own voice, because your voice is ultimately going to matter in the people that you're going to eventually touch with your work, right? um my second piece of advice would be to always make sure that you have tools at your disposal. Tools in the sense of writing tools, for example. Carry things around with you that you can write on, because the world is going to be the easiest place for you to take inspiration from when you're writing poems. And you may need like a notebook, or like, I know I make it like a tradition to like go out and find a new like really fancy looking notebook, because it's such a fun process and it's something I nerd out about. So I kind of like allow that to kind of fuel my process as well.
Yeah, those
Find a
blank
favorite.
books. Those blank
Yeah,
books are fabulous, aren't they? Good. I could
I
spend hours
oh
in Barnes and Noble just standing in the blank book area choosing one.
I drive I drive Barnes and Noble workers bananas, because I will just stand there and be like, like, let me touch this cover. Let me like
Yeah.
look at that, you know. But like, when you find those tools that you fall in love with, that those are going to help motivate you to keep writing. And okay, I do have a third piece of advice.
Yep.
Don't let people tell you you can't do it. You will have so many people, like, you will have so many people who will say that there is no worth in writing, that poetry is definitely not worth anything. Because I mean, poetry is a very specific, genre of writing, right? Um, and it can be very difficult for some people to access. But I think our challenge as writers is to help invite people in.
Yeah.
And if we can do that through poetry, that I think is a challenge that we should meet, not be discouraged by.
Well said. Very nice.
Yeah.
I like that.
Just a strange note to add to that, that kind of surprised me. For years, I've taken my books of poetry with me when I've been to book sales in person. And last year, A Slice of Passion, my book on poetry, the first one, was my second highest selling book for the year. I had to reorder 3 times during the year.
That's
Which
spectacular.
normally I don't have to do at all.
That's
Wow.
awesome.
I think we're seeing kind of a little bit of a change.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I like that you mentioned like carry your work with you. Like, that's super important too, because like sometimes on the fly, you might have somebody that you encounter that might need to see what you have to offer, right? So like, because I've also gotten into the habit of carrying my books with me. Um, and it's been very helpful, connecting with people, but also for sales too, because
Yeah.
that's always important.
That's always what we're doing, right? There was a poet that I edited her collection, 2 of them, and she used to carry them in her purse, and she would strike up conversations in the grocery line and end up selling books while she's waiting in line to buy her groceries or standing in line at the bank. I mean, the woman is amazing. I don't know how she does it, because I'm not that brave, but the opportunities to share, especially poetry, because I think poetry is a fascinating form of literature that allows people to experience us in the moment. We don't have to sit down and read a chapter. We don't have to sit down and read an entire section of a book to share the inner sanctum of who we are with somebody. It can be a 5-line poem.
Mhm.
It can be just a small little piece, and they open it. There was a piece in Andrew's book last year. I was sitting at a festival. I grabbed it. I opened it to a page and about fell off my chair and went, okay, that book is now mine. So there's an opportunity for us as writers, I think, to not only elevate the craft, but make it less fearful, which is what you're doing, right?
I
the
hope
work
so.
the work you're writing is eliminating fear in the way people see your lifestyle. But the fact that you're writing poetry specifically is also helping to create a new touchstone for poets everywhere, because your work is so accessible. So I'm tremendously grateful for
Thank you.
your
I
writing and
appreciate
how
that.
you're doing it. I'm so glad we met, because then
Me
I get
too.
to sit here and gush about, I know this really cool poet guy and he does this really neat work. And
Well, you just made my month. Thank you.
well, I'm glad. I want to share my screen one more time before we get to the spinning wheel of silliness over here. I want to share this because I want everybody to see the covers of these two spectacular books. The first is Carbon Footprint, and the second, which is what we were reading from tonight, was Feats of Alchemy. And I think whoever does your cover art should also be applauded here.
Oh, thank you.
The covers are just beautiful.
Yeah, I can briefly mention them if you would like.
Yes, please.
So one of my goals with each collection that I've done, and with any future one that I do, I want to enlist one of my friends who is an artist, who's never had like a professional publication as like an artist to do the art. So my friend Tiffany Schmieder Cups did the art for Carbon Footprint. She's a very talented landscape artist and portrait artist, and I was just really excited to have her do that one.
Yeah.
And then my friend Seth Stang did the cover art for this. Seth is an anime artist, and I love anime a lot. So I was like, I want the character of my book to look like a anime style. So
That's
I
very cool.
really appreciate them both.
I want to again acknowledge you for offering a platform to artists who may not already have one, or who are trying to establish a platform. I think that's a spectacular gift you're giving them. So thank you again.
Thank you.
I think that's very, very cool.
I appreciate that.
Any additional comments or questions from our room before I go to spin the wheel of happiness here?
Yes, I've got to put one out there.
Yeah, Andrew.
Where's book 3?
Book 3 is starting, and it like the itty bitty seeds are starting.
Excellent. Just since Andrew brought that up, how long did it take you to write each of the other two books?
Well,
just so that we can
Footprint,
like get an idea of when the third one will be out.
well, that's gonna make it impossible to gauge, because Carbon Footprint took like 4 years. And it's shorter than Feats of Alchemy, but because I was like kind of riding the success of my first book, I was like super excited, and I was like churning out poem after poem, and Feats of Alchemy came together in like a year and a half, maybe.
So how many pieces did you not put in Feats of Alchemy?
There's about a dozen pieces that did not make it to the final draft. They're kind of like stored someplace for future use. So
as an editor, I always find it fascinating to see what authors choose to leave out. I think that's a neat thing.
There were some like really like naturey poems that I kind of kept out, because that some of them would have probably fit better in that first collection, but yeah, they're stored somewhere. They probably will get used at some point.
Excellent. Yeah, don't delete anything.
Oh, I never do.
Yeah. In fact, make backups.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good writing tip too. Never delete anything you write.
Yeah. Any other comments or questions before we go to the wheel? No? Okay. Tonight, Donny is being tremendously generous, and he's giving away 2 copies of Feats of Alchemy to the people in the room tonight. Valanda, I'm sorry, I did not see your registration early enough, so I couldn't add you to the wheel. But you can go to Donny Winter's Amazon page, and you can find him and pick up the book there.
Oh, and Ainsley just asked what my website was. My website is donnywinter.com.
Well, that's easy.
Yeah, donnywinter.com.
That's super simple. Awesome. I love it when people do it simple. Just Use the name. Don't make me hunt for you. All right, let's share this screen. Go to the spinning wheel of happiness. We're going to spin it twice. I don't know if the sound will work or not. I never know. It depends on what headset I'm using on any given day. So someday Andrew will teach me how to fix it. But in the meantime, here we go. So the first spin is going to be for a paperback copy of Feats of Alchemy. Here we go. Ainsley, yay!
Woo!
And here we go. The second copy that Donny is giving away tonight is a hardcover edition of Feats of Alchemy. And by the way, folks, he's going to sign these for you before he ships them out. So, all that.
Yep.
Yay, Luba! Yay!
Woohoo!
Ainsley and Luba, you're both getting copies of Donny's book. He's going to sign them and get them to you. However, here is what you need to do to get that, to get your books that you won. You need to send me an email. Send it to diana@pagespromotions.com with your mailing address in that email. If you think I already have your mailing address, don't count on it because it's probably buried in my email collection somewhere and I may not be able to find it. So send me your mailing address. Again, it's Diana, DIANA, @pagespromotions.com. And I will forward the information to Donny and then he will ship out books to you. Donny, thank you so much for coming tonight. Thank you for sharing your soul, and thank
you for inviting me.
Thank you for creating such astounding sacred works. I believe everything we put on the page is sacred, and I believe it takes tremendous courage to do it. And so I thank you for that that strength to share that with us.
And thank you for having this outlet for writers like myself. It really means a lot.
Absolutely.
Thank you for all you do.
Oh, thank you. I'm just thrilled to do it. I mean, this is me just sitting around being selfish because I got to listen to poetry tonight, you know? That's what this is.
And I really appreciate all of you for coming too. It really means a lot. Thank you.
Yeah, it's so much better to read our work in front of an audience.
Mhm.
That's really what we love to do. So thank you everyone for coming tonight. If you missed it, or if you know of people who missed it, watch the Facebook page tomorrow. The YouTube replay will be up tomorrow on the Facebook page. You'll see the link there. Thank you everyone for joining us. Have a wonderful night.
Have a good night, everyone.
Night. Thank you.